Everyone knows how Dexter Morgan ended. A hurricane, a boat, and a lumberjack nobody asked for. Twice now, the show has killed him off for good. The man who ran the first 4 seasons has never once treated it as the end. In this video, we walk the entire Dexter timeline in order. Section 1. The book, the pilot, and the killer. Nobody thought a network would buy Jeff Lindsay. Had already spent years writing crime fiction that sold in modest numbers when he landed on the idea that changed his career. In 2004, he published a novel called Darkly Dreaming Dexter, built around a blood expert working for the Miami police who spent his nights hunting down murderers who had slipped past the courts. The book handed readers a narrator who explained his own violence in calm, patient language, treating every killing as a problem to be measured and solved rather than a moment of rage. Lindsay eventually stretched that single novel into a run of 8 books, closing the series out with one published in 2015, but the first one was the one that pulled Hollywood in almost right away. Part of what made the premise land was that it had roots in something real. One of the influences behind the idea of a killer who only targets other killers was a Brazilian man named Pedro Rodrigues Filho, who became known for hunting criminals and was charged with dozens of murders, though he once claimed the real number climbed past 100. That figure gave the whole concept a strange kind of credibility. A man who murders murderers was not purely a writing exercise. Somebody had already lived a version of it, which meant a story built on that idea could hold weight instead of collapsing into pure fantasy the moment anyone examined it closely. The book reached producer Sarah Colleton, who moved to option it, working alongside producer John Goldwyn. The job of turning a first-person novel about a serial killer into a weekly television series went to James Manos Jr., a writer who had already earned an Emmy for his work on The Sopranos, including a script for an episode called College. That background mattered. Manos had already helped build a show that asked audiences to spend hour after hour beside a man who did terrible things, and he understood the trick of keeping a viewer attached to someone they should logically want caught. He developed the series and wrote the first episode himself. Showtime was the network that said yes, and the timing worked in the show's favor. As a premium cable channel, Showtime did not need to answer to advertisers who might panic over content, and it was actively hunting for a drama big enough to define the brand the way certain shows had done for its competitors. A series about a police forensic specialist who killed people in plastic-lined rooms at night was exactly the kind of project that could never have survived a normal broadcast network development process. On a channel, viewers paid extra to receive. The same premise turned into a selling point. Casting the lead came down to Michael C. Hall, who had spent 5 seasons on 6 Feet Under playing David Fisher, a funeral home director wrestling with grief, family, and his own identity. Moving from a show set around dead bodies in a mortuary to a show set around dead bodies in a kill room looked like an odd career step on paper, but Hall brought exactly the quality the part needed. He could keep his face almost still while the narration explained something horrifying, and he could deliver Dexter's flat, curious observations without ever winking at the audience. The performance held the entire premise together because a broader or more theatrical actor would have turned the character into a cartoon within 3 episodes. The rest of the Miami Metro Police Department filled out around him. Jennifer Carpenter took the role of Deborah Morgan, Dexter's adoptive sister, a young officer desperate to make homicide and even more desperate for approval. Julie Benz played Rita Bennett, a nervous single mother recovering from an abusive marriage, chosen by Dexter precisely because she was as damaged as he was, pretending not to be. Eric King played Sergeant James Dokes, the one member of the department whose instincts screamed that something was wrong with the lab tech everybody else liked. David Zayas played Angel Batista, Lauren Velez played Lieutenant Maria LaGuerta, and C.S. Lee played Vince Masuka, the lab technician whose jokes rarely landed the way he hoped. James Remar took on Harry Morgan, the adoptive father who appeared mostly in flashbacks and inside Dexter's head, and Christian Camargo landed a role that Season 1 kept quiet for as long as it possibly could. Michael Cuesta directed the pilot, and the series premiered on Showtime on October 1, 2006. The first season pulled its story directly from Lindsay's first novel, which gave the writers a complete mystery to work with. Instead of forcing them to invent an arc from scratch, while still figuring out who these characters were. That decision paid off in structure. Season 1 moves with real confidence because the destination was already mapped out, and the show could spend its energy on tone, atmosphere, and the slow build of Dexter's inner voice, rather than scrambling to find an ending. The Miami of the series was largely a trick. While the show is set in Florida and used location work there, a huge amount of the exterior and interior filming happened in Los Angeles and Long Beach, California, with Long Beach landmarks turning up again and again across the run. The production leaned hard into color to sell the illusion, drenching everything in oranges, greens, and hot blues, so that the city felt sweaty and bright even during murder scenes. That look became part of the show's identity. Blood on a white shirt in harsh sunlight reads nothing like blood in a dark alley, and the series used that contrast constantly. Rolf Kent wrote the main title theme, and Daniel Licht scored the series itself, building a sound that mixed light Latin percussion with something slightly off underneath. The title sequence, produced by a design studio called Digital Kitchen, became one of the most talked about openings on television. It showed Dexter making and eating breakfast, shaving, tying his shoes, and getting dressed, all filmed in extreme close-up, so that a mosquito being crushed, a blood orange being squeezed, and an egg yolk breaking looked like evidence photographs from a homicide scene. The sequence won an Emmy for main title design in 2007, and it told the audience everything about the character without a single line of dialogue. Ordinary domestic life, shot like a slaughter. The show also built a language of its own that fans picked up immediately. Dexter kept a blood slide from every person he killed, a trophy system that doubled as a running counter of his body count. He described his urge as the dark passenger, a separate presence riding along inside him. He killed according to the Code of Harry, a set of rules his adoptive father drilled into him, with the central requirement being certainty. Dexter had to be certain a target had killed and would kill again before the plastic went up. Critics responded better than anyone at the network likely expected for a show about a murderer with a boat. Season 1 landed a score of 77 out of 100 on Metacritic, based on 27 reviews, making it the third best reviewed show of the 2006 fall season, and that tally included 4 perfect scores from major outlets. One of the few critics who panned it, Brian Lowry at Variety, publicly walked his negative review back in a year-end column after watching the full season. Hall picked up a Golden Globe nomination in December 2006, only a couple of months after the premiere, and the series went on to receive a Peabody Award in 2007, which is an unusual honor for a drama built around dismemberment. Not everyone was pleased. In December 2007, CBS announced it was considering airing Dexter reruns on broadcast television to fill schedule holes created by the Writers Guild of America strike. The Parents Television Council pushed back hard, and Council President Timothy Winter argued in a formal press release that the series belonged on a premium subscription channel because it pushed viewers to sympathize with a serial killer, root for him to win, and hope he never got caught. He called on the public to pressure local stations into dropping it and warned advertisers that the group would act against affiliates that sponsored it. CBS added parental advisory notices, rated the broadcast version for viewers 14 and older, and premiered the edited episodes on February 17, 2008, with cuts made mainly for language and for scenes involving sex or the dismemberment of living victims. Behind the camera, the person setting the tone through the show's strongest stretch was Clyde Phillips, who ran the series as showrunner across seasons 1 through 4. Phillips is the single most important name in the entire franchise beyond Hall himself, because he built the original formula, left it, and then came back many years later to build everything that followed. Under him, the series settled into a rhythm that later seasons kept trying to recapture. One large antagonist per season, smaller targets handled along the way, and a personal secret pressing down on Dexter from inside his own workplace. The core creative team also included executive producers Daniel Cerrone and Melissa Rosenberg, with Cerrone departing after the second season and Rosenberg serving as head writer through season 4. Those names matter for understanding why the show changed shape later. The people who established what Dexter was all left within a fairly narrow window, and the seasons that followed, were made by different hands working with a formula they had inherited rather than invented. The relationship between the books and the show is worth pinning down, because the two versions of Dexter Morgan split apart almost immediately and then went to completely different places. Lindsay's novels eventually pushed The Dark Passenger into supernatural territory, offering an origin for the urge that reached back into ancient history and treated it as something closer to a spirit than a psychological injury. The series never touched any of that. Television Dexter's darkness is trauma, plain and permanent, born in a shipping container rather than handed down from anything older. That single decision kept the show grounded, and it also meant that after the first season, the writers were building original material with no source text to consult. The structure they settled on, borrowed from a form crime fiction rarely uses on television. Most detective shows hide the killer and let the audience solve alongside the police. Dexter reverses it completely. The audience knows the murderer from the first minute, sits inside his head through narration, and spends every episode hoping the professionals stay stupid. That inversion is why the narration is not lazy writing. It is the entire engine, because the gap between what Dexter says to himself and what he says out loud is where all the tension lives. He tells the audience he feels nothing while doing things that only make sense if he feels a great deal. The timing of all this mattered as much as the content. The middle of the 2000s was the period when premium cable stopped being a place for movies and started being where the most ambitious drama on television lived, and Showtime spent those years chasing a rival network that had already built its reputation on morally compromised leads. Dexter arrived as the show that finally gave Showtime a name in that conversation, and it did it by going further than anyone else had dared. Audiences had been asked to root for gangsters and liars. Now they were being asked to root for a man who cut people into pieces on a table and kept a souvenir. The other decision worth flagging is how the series handled its own morality from the very first hour. Nothing in Season 1 argues that Dexter is right. The narration lets him make his case, the targets are chosen to make the case as strong as possible, and the show then spends years quietly dismantling it by showing what proximity to him does to everybody else. That patience is why the early seasons hold up. The writers trusted the audience to enjoy the fantasy while noticing the cost, and they never once had a character deliver a speech explaining which one the show believed in. What the first stretch of the franchise established was a machine with a very specific set of parts. A narrator who tells the audience the truth while lying to everyone around him. A police department close enough to catch him that every episode carries risk. A found family he does not fully understand but keeps trying to protect. And a code, inherited from a dead man, which the show spent the next 7 seasons slowly pulling apart. Every piece of that structure came out of decisions made before a single episode aired, and all of it traced back to one adoptive father and one very bad day in Miami decades earlier. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Long before any of this reached a screen, a 3-year-old boy sat inside a shipping container in Miami for 2 days, in blood up to his ankles. The man who found him made a choice that day that no police officer should ever make. What he decided in that container built everything that came after it. Section 2, 1973, the shipping container, and the Code of Harry. The earliest point on the whole map is a woman named Laura Moser. She lived in Miami in the early 1970s. She had 2 young sons, and she was working as a confidential informant for the Miami Police Department. Her handler was a detective named Harry Morgan. Their relationship crossed every professional line that existed, moving from police work into an affair, and Harry kept pushing her to stay inside a drug operation long after any reasonable officer would have pulled her out. Laura was feeding him information about a cocaine crew that included a man named Hector Estrada, and the deeper she went, the more useful she became to Harry's case, and the more exposed she became to the men she was informing on. The crew figured it out. In late 1973, Laura Moser and 3 other people were taken to a shipping container at a Miami port and killed with chainsaws. Estrada gave the order, and a man named Santos Jimenez was among the ones who carried it out. The killing was not quick, and it was not clean, and the men who did it did something worse than simply murdering 4 adults. Laura's 2 sons were inside the container while it happened. Her older boy, Brian, was old enough to understand exactly what he was watching. Dexter was 3. Nobody came for 2 days. The 2 children sat in that container in a pool of blood that came up past their ankles, in Florida heat, beside the remains of their mother, until police finally opened the doors. Harry Morgan was one of the officers who walked in. He had spent months pushing the informant who now lay in pieces on the floor, and he found her youngest son sitting in what was left of her. Whatever guilt landed on him in that moment shaped every decision he made for the rest of his life, and it shaped the boy he carried out of there. Harry took Dexter home. The adoption was pushed through, and the boy grew up in a house in Miami with Harry, his wife Doris, and their daughter Deborah. What Harry did not do was take both boys. Brian was older, he remembered everything, and by the time doctors got hold of him, he was already showing signs that the system labeled dangerous. He was placed in psychiatric care and moved through a series of foster homes, and Harry made the deliberate choice to save the child, who might still be salvaged, and leave the one who might not. Dexter was never told he had a brother. The memory of the container itself was buried so deeply that he grew up with no recollection of it at all, which meant he spent decades not knowing why he was built the way he was. The Morgan house was not a happy place before Dexter arrived. Harry and Doris had already lost a child. Their biological son, a boy Harry called Junior, drowned in the family swimming pool, and that death left a hole in the middle of the marriage that never fully closed. Bringing home a traumatized 3-year-old was partly guilt and partly repair, an attempt to fill a room that had gone quiet. Deborah was born into that household as the child who came after all of it, and she spent her entire childhood competing for the attention of a father who was privately pouring most of his focus into her adopted brother for reasons she was never allowed to know. Doris Morgan died of cancer while Dexter and Deborah were still young, which left Harry raising 2 children alone while working homicide cases and hiding an increasingly strange secret about his son. A records clerk at the department named Camilla Figg was close to the family through all of it, and she became one of the few people alive who knew fragments of the truth about how Dexter came into the Morgan house. Years later, she was the one who quietly handed him the file that filled in the blanks. The strangeness in Dexter showed up early. He did not react to affection the way other children did. He could not summon grief when it was expected of him, and he became fascinated by death in a way that had nothing to do with fear. He started killing animals. He buried what he killed in the woods near the house, and eventually, Harry found the graves, along with the remains of a neighborhood dog named Buddy. Any other parent in that situation would have called a doctor. Harry was a homicide detective who had spent his career watching what happened to men whose urges went unmanaged, and he made a calculation that no police officer should ever make. He decided the urge could not be removed, so it would be aimed. Harry told his son that the need was permanent, that it would never leave him, and that his only real choice was what he pointed it at. That decision hardened into a set of rules the show called the Code of Harry, and those rules run underneath every single hour of television the franchise produced. Never get caught. Never leave evidence. Be certain the target has killed. Be certain they will kill again. Choose only the ones who slipped through the courts, the ones a badge and a jury could not touch. And above all, blend in so thoroughly that nobody ever thinks to look. That last rule became the largest part of Dexter's daily life. Harry taught him how to fake the things other people felt naturally, how to smile at the right point in a conversation, how to bring donuts to the office, how to laugh at a joke he did not understand, how to build a personality out of borrowed pieces so that nobody at work ever looked at him twice. The hunting trips father and son took were partly training and partly the only place either of them could talk honestly. Out in the woods, Harry could discuss the thing Dexter was without pretending, and Dexter could ask questions that would have gotten him committed anywhere else. Harry also steered his career. He wanted his son near police work rather than outside it, because proximity meant access to case files, evidence, and the ability to know when an investigation was closing in. The original plan Harry pushed hardest was medicine. He hoped Dexter might become a surgeon, on the theory that a job that allowed him to cut into people legally, with a purpose, might absorb enough of the pressure to keep him from ever needing a kill room. That idea eventually collapsed, but it explains why Dexter ended up in a laboratory rather than a squad car. Forensics gave him the crime scene without the badge, the science without the oath, and a legitimate reason to know exactly how murderers get caught. The blood came later, and it fit him perfectly. Dexter specialized in bloodstain pattern analysis, the discipline of reading spatter, drips, and pools to reconstruct what happened in a room. It made him valuable to the department, and it made him extraordinary at hiding his own work, because a man who spends his days explaining how blood betrays a killer knows precisely how to make sure his own never does. His kill rooms were built out of that knowledge. Plastic on every surface, a table, tools laid out in order, and a body cut into manageable pieces and dropped into the ocean, where the current could carry it away from any shoreline that might return it. The trophy came out of the same instinct. Dexter took a single drop of blood from each person he killed, mounted it on a glass slide, and stored the slides in a wooden box he kept inside his air conditioner. Harry never approved of that part. Nothing in the code allowed for souvenirs, and a box of labeled evidence hidden in an apartment was the single greatest weakness in an otherwise careful operation. Dexter kept it anyway, which was the first sign that his father's rules were being followed by choice rather than obeyed completely. Harry's own career sits underneath all of this like a stain. He was regarded as a good detective, respected in the building, and the kind of officer whose name still opened doors decades after his death. He also ran an informant into the ground for the sake of a case, slept with her, and then covered the worst parts of the file. Everything he taught his son about certainty, discipline, and never leaving evidence came from a man who had personally caused a woman to be cut apart in a metal box and then filed paperwork that made it look cleaner than it was. The code was not a philosophy handed down from a wise father. It was damage control, written by somebody trying to fix one specific mistake by managing its only survivor. Deborah grew up on the wrong side of that arrangement, and the show never lets the audience forget it. She wanted to be a police officer because her father was one. She chased his approval her whole childhood, and she never understood why the son, who was not even blood, got the private conversations, the hunting trips, and the endless patience. Harry was not favoring Dexter out of affection. He was managing a problem, and the effect on his daughter was the same either way. Every part of Deborah's adult personality, the swearing, the aggression, the desperate need to be told she is doing well, traces back to a house where the attention was going somewhere she was not allowed to see. Dexter's teenage years were spent building the disguise he wore for the rest of his life. He learned to be pleasant rather than warm, present rather than involved, and just slightly boring, because boring people do not get examined. He worked out that people accept almost any behavior if it comes with a joke and a normal tone of voice. He also learned that most people will explain away almost anything if the explanation is dull enough, and that the safest place to stand in any room is slightly to the side of the conversation. None of it came naturally. All of it was rehearsed, and the show returns to that fact whenever it wants to remind the audience that the pleasant man at the crime scene is a construction. Brian's path was the opposite in every way. He was old enough to keep the memory, which meant every institution that handled him saw a disturbed child and a case file rather than a son. Nobody in any of those rooms was teaching him rules, certainty, or restraint. He built his own method with no supervision at all, and no reason to aim it at anyone in particular. The franchise makes the contrast explicit later. 2 boys came out of the same container. One got a father who taught him to hide. The other got paperwork. The container itself never stopped mattering to the franchise either. Shipping containers keep turning up at the worst moments of Dexter's life, and the series uses them deliberately, as a room he can never actually leave. Whatever else the code was supposed to accomplish, it never got him out of that box. 2 other pieces of that childhood ended up mattering enormously later. The first was that Harry never told Deborah any of it, which meant the closest relationship in Dexter's life was built on a foundation his father designed to be permanently dishonest. The second was that Dexter's memory of the container stayed sealed. He knew he had been adopted. He knew his mother had died, and he had no working recollection of the day itself. He described his own condition as something he was born with, an emptiness he had always carried, because nothing in his conscious mind connected it to 2 days spent sitting in blood. The version of these events shown across the franchise is not always identical, which is worth noting for anyone trying to line the timeline up precisely. The original series revealed this history slowly, mostly through flashbacks and dialogue, and treated Harry as a well-meaning man who made one terrible decision under pressure. The prequel that arrived decades later went back and filled in the same events at much greater length, giving Laura Moser far more screen time, showing Harry pushing her harder and longer, and making the guilt behind the adoption look much less noble than the original flashbacks suggested. The broad facts hold. The moral weight shifted. What the shipping container produced, in the end, was 2 brothers built out of the same afternoon. One was raised inside a police family and taught to aim his violence at people the law had failed to punish. The other was handed to institutions and left to figure out his own rules, with nobody guiding him at all. Both of them grew up hunting. Only one of them believed he was doing something acceptable, and that belief came from a set of instructions written by a man who never once stopped to consider whether teaching a child to kill efficiently might be worse than teaching him not to kill at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The rules existed for years before they were ever used on a person. Somewhere in Miami in 1991, a nurse walked into a hospital room with a syringe and no idea who was watching her. What happened after that took Harry's careful theory and turned it into a body. Section 3, 1991. And Dexter, Original Sin Dexter. Original Sin drops the audience into Miami in 1991, 15 years before the events of the original series, at the exact moment Harry's theory stops being a theory. Patrick Gibson plays Dexter as a young man in his early 20s, still living at home, still enrolled at the University of Miami, and still following the medical track his father laid out for him. Christian Slater plays Harry, Molly Brown plays a teenage Deborah, and Michael C. Hall returns to voice the inner monologue, which means audiences hear the familiar narration coming out of a face that is not his. That single choice does a lot of work. The voice in Dexter's head already sounds like the man he will become, even while the body it belongs to is still fumbling through basic adult life. The department around him is stacked with names longtime viewers already know. Christina Milian plays Maria LaGuerta, working homicide as the first woman in the unit, and already learning how to fight for position in a room full of men. James Martinez plays a younger Angel Batista. Alex Shimizu plays Vince Masuka, whose personality was apparently fully formed by 1991 and has not improved since. Reno Wilson plays Bobby Watt, Harry's partner. Patrick Dempsey plays Captain Aaron Spencer, who runs the homicide division. Sarah Michelle Gellar plays Tanya Martin, the chief of forensics, which makes her Dexter's first boss and the person who unknowingly hands a serial killer the keys to a crime lab. The way Dexter gets that job is one of the sharpest ideas in the prequel. He wanders through a campus job fair with no enthusiasm for anything on offer until he passes a forensics display covered in photographs of real corpses. Standing there looking at pictures most students would walk away from, he notices something nobody at the department has caught. 2 of the crime scene photos on the board came from the same killer. That observation gets back to Miami Metro, and the offer that follows is a paid internship in forensics. Dexter takes a step toward the police because the police put dead bodies on a poster board, and he could not stop looking at them. The case running through the department at that point involves a string of home invasions that have left 8 people dead, including an entire family. Miami Metro pulls a bloody fingerprint off a television remote at the Shapiro house and lands on a suspect named Levi Reed. They arrest him, and then Harry loses the case. He throws out an alibi provided by Reed's girlfriend, a woman who was under the influence at the time, and the mistake is serious enough that Reed walks free with nothing hanging over him. That failure sits at the center of everything the season is building toward, because it is the moment Harry's professional world proves that his rules exist for a reason. Before Reed, though, comes the nurse. The season sets it up through a personal disaster. Dexter attends a party with Deborah, she drinks far too much, and a boy takes her upstairs and tries to take advantage of her. Dexter finds them and comes very close to killing him on the spot. Later, on a hunting trip, he tells his father exactly how close he came, and the stress of hearing it triggers a heart attack. Dexter carries Harry out of the woods and gets him to a hospital, which should be the end of the emergency. It is not. The nurse assigned to Harry's recovery is a woman named Mary, and she is an angel of death. She has been quietly killing patients for years, and she keeps obituary clippings of the people who die under her care. Dexter, who spends his hospital visits studying grief the way other people study a sport, notices her collecting them. He starts looking closer and works out that she has been injecting his father with a substance that would stop his heart within days and leave nothing suspicious behind. Harry, lying in a hospital bed, getting worse by the hour, gives his son permission to handle it. Dexter breaks into her apartment, wraps the room in plastic, and waits. The kill itself is clumsy compared to anything he does later, but it works, and one detail from it becomes the foundation of his entire adult psychology. He describes it as the first time he ever felt another person's fear, and he liked it. He drives her body out to a swamp and lets alligators dispose of the evidence, and he keeps her earrings, admitting to himself even as he does it that keeping anything at all is a mistake. Harry's condition improves almost immediately, and he makes a full recovery. The cost of that recovery is that his son now has a body count. Kill number 2 is a man named Tony Ferrer. Connected to a shooting, Dexter works as a fresh forensics intern. Dexter tracks him, puts him in a sleeper hold, kills him, and drives the remains out to the same swamp. It is sloppy work, and the problems it creates teach him lessons that show up as habits 15 years later. Kill number 3 is Levi Reed, and this is the one where the character everyone recognizes finally appears. Dexter uses the sedative M99 to knock him out, arranges photographs of the family Reed murdered so his victim has to look at them, and finishes it with a blade to the chest. Every trademark of a mature Dexter Morgan kill is present in that room. The plastic, the drug, the photos, the confrontation, and the single deliberate wound. Running alongside Dexter's education is the season's main investigation, and it is grim. A killer targets the son of a judge known for going after the cartels, mails one of the boy's fingers to the family, murders him, and then hangs his body from a bridge in Miami for the city to find. Dexter, who feels almost nothing about most crime scenes, is enraged by that one and decides on the spot that he is going to kill whoever did it. The eventual answer lands close to home. The man behind it is Captain Aaron Spencer, who runs the homicide division, and the reveal comes when he abducts his own son using the exact same method. The head of the unit investigating the murders had been committing them. The prequel also plants the seed of the show's very first villain. A killer working Miami in 1991 targets people the department writes off, the homeless and the transient, cases that officers filed under a label meaning nobody important was involved. That killer is Brian Moser, Dexter's biological brother, already active, already methodical, and still 15 years away from the crime spree that opens the original series. Roby Attal plays him as a young adult, and the character moves through the season as a shadow rather than a presence, which is the correct choice. Two brothers hunting the same city without either of them knowing the other exists is the kind of detail a prequel earns simply by existing. Laura Moser gets far more room here than the original series ever gave her. Brittany Allen plays her in extended flashbacks that lay out the informant operation in detail, including Harry pressuring her to get closer to Hector Estrada, the affair between them, her growing exhaustion with a case that will not end, and her attempts to get out. Randy Gonzalez appears as Santos Jimenez, Carlo Mendez as Estrada, and Joe Pantoliano turns up as a hitman called Mad Dog. Kathleen Rose Perkins plays Barb, the social worker who handles Brian's placement, which puts a face on the decision to split the brothers apart. Jasper Lewis plays Doris Morgan in flashback, and Sarah Kinsey plays a young Camilla Fig. The season even slips in a young Miguel Prado, played by Nick Santucci, years before he becomes one of the franchise's best antagonists. The prequel leans hard into its period, and the choice pays off more than it usually does, with shows set in the recent past. This is Miami, years before the internet became a household thing, which means no mobile phones, no databases anyone can search from a desk, no security cameras on every corner, and forensic science that is still largely a matter of eyes, chemicals, and paper files. A young Dexter Morgan, operating in 1991, has advantages his older self never had, and the series uses that gap deliberately. Titles like Miami Vice and Blood Drive sit on episodes that are partly period jokes and partly a reminder of what the city looked like in popular imagination at the time. The Forensics Lab gives the show its best new relationship. Tanya Martin runs the department's forensic side, and Sarah Michelle Gellar plays her as somebody sharp enough to be intimidating and generous enough to be a genuine mentor, which puts her in the unfortunate position of nurturing the most dangerous person in the building. She spots his talent immediately and pushes him forward, and every compliment she pays him is technically accurate and completely misplaced. Alongside her, Masuka in 1991 is already the same person he will be in 2013, which is either a writing shortcut or the darkest joke in the show. Around the edges, the prequel fills in the social world Dexter had to learn to fake. Raquel Justice plays Sofia Rivera, Deborah's best friend, who develops a crush on him and gets nothing back that resembles a normal reaction. Aaron Jennings plays Clark Sanders, a closeted officer at Miami Metro who becomes one of the few people Dexter actually likes, largely because Clark is also hiding a version of himself from the department every single day. That parallel is handled with restraint, and it gives the season one of its better ideas. Dexter is surrounded by people performing, and he is the only one whose performance is covering murder. Patrick Gibson's performance is also the reason the whole thing holds together, because the part is close to impossible. He has to play a man who has not yet built the mask, which means the charm is patchy, the social timing is wrong, and the emptiness is visible to anyone paying attention. Watching him fumble a conversation that the older version would have handled without thinking is the clearest illustration of how much of Dexter Morgan was constructed on purpose. The production history behind all of this is worth understanding because the prequel arrived as part of a much larger plan. Showtime ordered an origin story series on February 6, 2023, under the working title Dexter: Origins, created by Clyde Phillips, who was returning to run the franchise he had shaped in the first place. The title changed to Dexter: Original Sin. The order was set at 10 episodes, and Phillips took the showrunner job with Scott Reynolds, Michael C. Hall, Mary Leah Sutton, Tony Hernandez, and Lily Burns among the executive producers. Patrick Gibson, Christian Slater, and Molly Brown were announced in the lead roles on May 23, 2024. Filming began in Miami on June 5, 2024, and later moved to Los Angeles, which is the same trick the original series used for 8 seasons. The series premiered on December 13, 2024, on Paramount Plus with Showtime, and the numbers were strong immediately. It became Showtime's most streamed premiere at the time, pulling more than 2.1 million global cross-platform viewers. Critics were more measured. Rotten Tomatoes logged a 70% approval rating based on 20 reviews, with an average score of 6.6 out of 10, and Metacritic calculated a 50 out of 100 from 6 reviews for the premiere, which sits squarely in mixed territory. The general read from reviewers was that the prequel was competent, familiar, and not especially interested in doing anything the original had not already done. The business side got messy. Reports emerged on April 1, 2025, that the series had been renewed for a second season. Then on August 22, 2025, before production on that season began, Dexter: Original Sin was canceled outright, reversing the renewal. Showrunner Clyde Phillips had already been openly non-committal about a second run months earlier, saying he had been busy shooting another entry in the franchise and had not been thinking about it, while cast members including Gibson said publicly that they would be glad to come back. The story of young Dexter, as of that cancellation, ends after 10 episodes with a great deal of ground still unwalked. One more structural detail matters more than anything else in the prequel. Original Sin wraps its 1991 story inside a frame set decades later, opening with an adult Dexter bleeding out in the back of a police vehicle and being rushed into a hospital. Michael C. Hall appears in that frame, and the entire season is presented as a dying man's memory of his own beginning. Buried inside that framing device was a piece of information about Dexter's condition that quietly rewrote where the franchise was headed, and it was delivered in the premiere of a prequel rather than announced as news. By the end of 1991, everything that defines the character is locked in place. He has a job inside a police department, he has a sedative, a set of tools, and a routine, and he has proven that his father's rules can be applied to a human being without the whole plan collapsing. He also has one habit Harry never sanctioned. He keeps something from every single one of them, because feeling nothing all day makes a man hungry for proof that any of it happened. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 15 years later, a killer starts leaving bodies around Miami, with the blood already drained out of them, cut so cleanly that even the department's blood expert admires the work. Every piece is arranged for one specific person to find. Somebody has been watching Dexter for a very long time. Section 4, Season 1, 2006, and the Ice Truck Killer. By the time the original series opens, Dexter Morgan has been operating for roughly 15 years and has the whole thing running like a small business. He works days at Miami Metro as the department's blood-spatter analyst. He brings donuts to the office because Harry told him to, and he keeps a boat called Slice of Life docked nearby for the disposal side of his schedule. His first kill on screen is a church choir director named Mike Donovan, who had been murdering young boys, and the scene lays out the whole procedure in a few minutes. The plastic, the photographs of the victims, the demand that the man look at what he did, and the single controlled cut. His cover life is built with the same care. He is dating Rita Bennett, a single mother of 2 children, Astor and Cody, who is still recovering from a marriage to an abusive husband currently sitting in prison. Dexter chose her precisely because she was too damaged to want physical intimacy, which made her the perfect girlfriend for a man who felt nothing and needed to look normal. That calculation quietly falls apart over the season as Rita starts healing, which creates the first real crack in a life he had engineered to stay static. His sister Deborah is stuck in vice, desperate to make homicide, and constantly asking her brother to put a word in for her because their father's name still carries weight in the building. The department around them runs on politics. Lieutenant Maria LaGuardia plays every angle available to protect her position. Captain Tom Matthews manages the press. Angel Batista does the actual work. And Sergeant James Dokes spends most of his screen time staring at Dexter with open hostility. Dokes is the only person in the building whose instincts are working correctly, and the show treats his suspicion as a running threat rather than a mystery, because the audience already knows he is right. Then the bodies start appearing. Women, cut into pieces, arranged carefully, and completely drained of blood. No spatter, no pooling, nothing at the scenes at all. For the department, it is a nightmare. For Dexter, it is close to a religious experience. He stands over remains that have been cleaned of the one substance that fascinates him and finds himself admiring the technique, because whoever did this understood something about blood that he had assumed nobody else did. The press names the killer after the refrigerated truck used to freeze the bodies, and the ice truck killer becomes the case that defines the season. The clues stop looking like coincidence very quickly. Body parts turn up on a hockey rink. A victim is arranged in a way that pulls something loose in Dexter's head. Dismembered dolls appear, staged with the same precision as the corpses. Piece by piece, the killer builds displays that mean almost nothing to the police and everything to one man. And Dexter starts having flashbacks he cannot explain, images of a container, and blood on a floor that his conscious mind has never held. Nobody is leaving a trail here. Somebody is trying to remind him of something. The investigation gives Deborah the break she has been begging for. She works the case hard, goes undercover as a prostitute to draw the killer out, and finally lands her transfer into homicide. It also gives her a boyfriend. She meets a prosthetic specialist named Rudy Cooper, played by Christian Camargo, a calm and considerate man who takes an unusual amount of interest in her family. Rudy asks about Dexter constantly. He wants to know how the brother and sister grew up, what their father was like, how close they are. Deborah reads all of it as a man trying to fit into her life, while the department chases the wrong leads, including a false confessor named Neil Perry, who wastes weeks of investigative time. Dexter pursues a much older case. Camilla Figg, the records clerk who has known him since childhood, gives him access to the file on the shipping container murders. What he reads fills in the blank space at the center of his life. His mother was Laura Moser. She was an informant. She was killed with a chainsaw while he sat in the container beside her for 2 days. His adoptive father had been her handler, and the police report that Harry filed left out the parts that mattered most. Dexter tracks down Santos Jimenez, one of the men who swung a chainsaw that day, and finds him running a small operation in Miami decades after the fact. That kill is different from all the others. There is no code involved, no careful weighing of whether the man qualified under Harry's rules. Dexter takes him because of what he did to a woman Dexter barely remembers, which is the first time in the series he kills for something as human as a grudge. The reveal, when it lands, reframes the entire season. Rudy Cooper does not exist. The man dating Deborah is Brian Moser, Laura's older son, the boy left behind in the container and shuffled through psychiatric care and foster homes, while Harry took the younger brother home. Every stage display, every body drained of blood, every doll arranged on a table was a message aimed at one person. Brian was not taunting the police. He was courting his brother, using the only language either of them spoke fluently, and he had spent the season getting close to Deborah specifically to build the leverage he needed for the ending he had planned. That ending is one of the best sequences the show ever produced. Brian takes Deborah, wraps her in plastic on a table, in the exact way Dexter wraps his own victims, and offers his brother the reunion he has been building toward. Kill her together. Cut the last tie to the family that separated them. Walk away from the borrowed life, and be what they both actually are. He is not threatening Dexter. He is inviting him home, and the show makes it painfully clear that part of Dexter wants to accept. He chooses his sister instead, and that choice is the thesis of the entire series. The fake life he built as camouflage has become the only thing holding him together, and the brother offering him honesty is offering him something he can no longer survive. Dexter kills Brian afterward, cuts his throat, and stages the scene so that it reads as a suicide. He kills the only person on Earth who understood him without needing to be lied to, and he does it to protect a relationship built entirely on lies. The finale, called Born Free, closes with one of the show's most quoted images. Dexter drives through Miami, imagining a crowd of people lining the streets, cheering for him, throwing flowers, thanking him for the work he does. It is a fantasy about being seen and celebrated rather than hidden, and it arrives immediately after he has murdered the one man who actually saw him. That gap between the fantasy and the reality of the season is the engine that drives everything the show does for the next 7 years. A second thread runs underneath all of it. Rita's ex-husband, Paul Bennett, played by Mark Pellegrino, gets released from prison and starts pushing his way back into her life and his children's lives. Dexter, unwilling to kill a man who does not meet the code, but unwilling to leave him in place, knocks him out and plants evidence that sends him back inside. It is a small piece of business that gets a lot of use later, because it establishes early that Dexter will destroy an inconvenient person's entire life without killing them if the situation calls for it. A few of the season's smaller pieces are worth pulling out because they set patterns that ran for years. Dexter's targets between the major plot beats establish exactly how the code works in practice. A drunk driver who had killed repeatedly and kept getting released. A man who had been abusing and murdering with no meaningful investigation attached to him. Each one is presented briefly and clinically, and the show uses those minor kills to make a point it never states out loud. The targets are always people the legal system had an opportunity to stop and did not, which means every one of them functions as an argument for Dexter's existence, and the series is careful to keep that argument working on the audience, while slowly revealing that it does not hold up. Deborah's undercover work also deserves attention, because it is the first time the show turns its attention to how badly the department treats her. She volunteers to pose as a prostitute to draw out a man who dismembers women, spends nights alone on Miami streets as bait, and the payoff for her risk is a transfer she then has to keep defending. The stretch also gives the season its cruelest structural irony. Deborah earns her place in homicide by working the ice truck killer case, and the reason the case exists at all is that a man is trying to get her brother's attention. Dokes gets shortchanged by a lot of casual retellings of Season 1, and the show is smarter about him than it first appears. He is not written as a bully who happens to be right by accident. He is a former Special Forces operator who has killed people himself, which is exactly why he recognizes something familiar in the polite lab technician nobody else looks at twice. His hostility comes from pattern recognition rather than prejudice. The department dismisses him because Dexter is likable and Dokes is not, and that dynamic is the quiet horror underneath the whole show. Being pleasant is more protective than being innocent. The season also does something worth noticing with Rita's children. Aster and Cody are used almost entirely as camouflage in the early episodes, props in a life Dexter assembled for appearances. By the end of the year, he is defending them, buying them things, and rearranging his schedule around them, and he narrates the whole process as if it were happening to somebody else. The show never has him announce a change of heart. It simply keeps showing him do things his stated personality should make impossible, and lets the audience notice. By the closing episodes, every relationship in the series has been established in the shape it holds for years. Deborah loves him without knowing him. Rita loves a person he invented. The department relies on him professionally, while one officer quietly hunts him. Harry exists only as a voice in flashbacks that keeps getting less trustworthy the more the audience learns. And Dexter has killed the one person who offered him a life without any of the performance, which he interpreted as loyalty, and which the show frames as the moment he chose the cage. Season 1 is also where the slides stop being a quirk and start being a countdown. Dexter explains his own carelessness by calling the box a reminder that his life is real, which is the only excuse he ever offers for keeping the single most incriminating object in the state of Florida 6 feet from where he sleeps. He keeps it for 8 seasons, and the franchise returns to those slides again and again, including decades later, in a billionaire's trophy vault, because they are the one piece of evidence he was never willing to destroy. Christian Camargo's performance is also the reason the reveal works at all. He plays Rudy Cooper as gentle, attentive, and slightly sad, the kind of boyfriend a woman like Deborah would decide she deserved, and none of it reads as an act on a first viewing. Watched again with the answer in hand, every scene turns into a man studying a family from the inside. The season also holds a detail that only becomes obvious in hindsight. Season 1 adapted Jeff Lindsay's first novel fairly closely for most of its run, and then broke away at the end. In the book, the confrontation resolves very differently, with the brother surviving and slipping away. The series killed him off, which meant the show and the novels split permanently after 12 episodes, and every later season was written without any book to fall back on. Season 1 aired 12 episodes from October 4th to December 17th, 2006, and reviewers came around fast. Rotten Tomatoes settled at an 83% approval rating with a score of 8.0 out of 10, and the critical consensus described it as a compelling, elegantly built horror drama with a premise too grotesque for some viewers. Behind the scenes, Michael C. Hall and Jennifer Carpenter, playing a brother and sister who spend the season circling each other, began a relationship during production and married at the end of 2008, a marriage that ended in divorce a few years later, while both were still working together every day. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Everything Dexter dumped into the ocean over 15 years was sitting in one place on the sea floor, weighted down and forgotten. In the opening weeks of the next season, a group of recreational divers goes looking for a shipwreck. What they find turns Miami's biggest manhunt into a search for him. Section 5, Season 2, 2007, and The Bay Harbor Butcher. Season 2 opens with Dexter, broken in a way the show had not tried before. Killing his brother cost him something, and for the first time in his adult life, the routine does not work. He stalks a target and cannot finish. He gets a man onto a table and freezes. The dark passenger, the thing he has spent his whole life describing as an unstoppable need, has gone quiet, and he has no framework for a version of himself that does not kill. Michael C. Hall plays those early episodes as a man with the flu, drained and distracted, and the show uses that emptiness to walk him straight into the worst possible timing. A group of recreational divers goes looking for a wreck off the coast and finds something else. Weighted bags on the seafloor, packed with dismembered remains, holding the victims of more than a dozen separate murders. 15 years of Dexter's work is sitting there in one place, and the discovery detonates the biggest case in Miami's history. The press names the unknown killer the Bay Harbor Butcher. The city panics, and the FBI moves in. Every hour of the season after that runs on a single fact the audience holds, and the characters do not. The task force hunting the butcher includes the butcher, and he is the one they keep asking to interpret the evidence. The FBI sends Special Agent Frank Lundy, played by Keith Carradine, and he is one of the best characters the series ever produced. Lundy is patient, courteous, and quietly relentless, a man who builds profiles by paying attention rather than shouting. He is also right about almost everything. He works out that the killer is local, organized, connected to law enforcement, and selective about victims, and he pulls Dexter onto the task force as a blood expert because Dexter is the most qualified analyst in the building. Deborah joins the team as well and starts a relationship with Lundy, which puts her sleeping beside the man closing in on her brother. Sergeant Dokes stops pretending. He has spent a year convinced something is wrong with Dexter, and the butcher case gives that instinct a shape. He follows him, sits outside his apartment, tracks his movements, and makes no effort to hide any of it. The department eventually pushes him out of the investigation because his behavior looks unhinged, which frees him up to do nothing except watch Dexter full-time. The show plays Dokes as an obstacle, but it never lets the audience forget that he is the only honest cop in the story, punished for being correct. To explain his own erratic behavior to Rita, Dexter reaches for the easiest lie available and claims he is a drug addict. That lie forces him into a 12-step program, and the program introduces Leela West, played by Jaime Murray. Lila is a British artist who becomes his sponsor, and she is drawn to the emptiness in him with an accuracy nobody else in his life manages. She tells him she can see what he is, and that she is not frightened by it, which is exactly the sentence a man in his position cannot resist. The affair that follows destroys his relationship with Rita and hands him a partner who is far less controllable than he assumed. Lila is the season's second predator, and the show is careful about it. She is not a serial killer with a code or a plan. She is a person who wants Dexter and who removes obstacles without any of the discipline he was raised on. She burns down her own loft to manufacture sympathy. She lies to Rita's face. She escalates every time he tries to pull away. And by the final stretch of the season, she has become the most dangerous element in a story that also features a citywide manhunt and an FBI task force. Dexter's own work resumes as the season goes on, including a gang enforcer named Little Chino and a couple running a human trafficking operation. But the kills matter less than the tightening net. Dokes finally gets what he has been chasing. He follows Dexter to a cabin in the Everglades and finds the box of blood slides, and in that moment the sergeant holds proof of everything he suspected. Dexter drugs him and locks him in a cage inside the cabin, and the show does something deeply uncomfortable with the next several episodes. Two men sit across from each other, one in a cage, and talk honestly, because Dokes is now the only person alive who knows the truth. Dexter cannot kill him. That is the point. Dokes is not a murderer who slipped the courts. He is a decorated officer who was doing his job well, and killing him would break the code at its foundation. Dexter spends days circling the problem, at one point seriously preparing to turn himself in and end the whole thing. The solution arrives from outside. Lila finds the cabin, works out what is happening, and solves her boyfriend's problem for him by rigging the propane and blowing the building apart with Dokes still locked inside. The fallout is grotesquely convenient, and the show knows it. With Dokes dead in a cabin, surrounded by evidence, the department reaches the conclusion the evidence supports. Sergeant James Dokes was the Bay Harbor Butcher. The case closes. Lundy leaves Miami with the wrong name on his file. LaGuerta refuses to accept it and spends years quietly unable to let it go. And Dexter walks away from the single largest threat of his life because a woman he never should have touched murdered a man he could not bring himself to touch. He does not let Lila live with it. Dexter tracks her to Paris and kills her there, closing the season by cleaning up the one loose end that was never part of any plan. It is also the moment the code's cracks become visible. Lila did not qualify under Harry's rules any more than Dokes did, and Dexter killed her anyway because she was a threat to the life he had built. From season 2 onward, the rules bend whenever the rules become inconvenient. The season also fills in the last blank space around Harry Morgan. Dexter learns that his father did not simply die of a heart condition. Harry took his own life with an overdose of his heart medication, and he did it after walking in on his son standing over a body. The man who designed the code, who insisted the urge could be aimed and controlled, saw the finished product with his own eyes and could not live with what he had built. That revelation poisons every flashback in the series retroactively. Every calm lesson in the woods becomes the work of a man who was wrong and would eventually know it. The task force scenes are some of the most enjoyable material the show ever produced because they let Dexter sit in a room while professionals describe him with uncomfortable accuracy. Lundy builds his profile out loud, piece by piece, and the audience watches Dexter absorb the analysis with the polite attention of a man taking notes on himself. Lundy identifies the discipline, the organization, the selection process, and the likelihood of a law enforcement connection, and he does it without ever raising his voice. Then he asks Dexter for his professional opinion on the evidence, and Dexter provides an answer that is technically expert testimony and functionally sabotage. The city's reaction is one of the season's smartest choices. Once the details leak, a portion of Miami decides the Bay Harbor butcher is doing something useful. The victims recovered from the water are eventually identified as murderers, rapists, and men who walked out of courtrooms, and public opinion splits. People make shirts. Callers defend him on the radio. LaGuerta has to manage press conferences where reporters ask why the police are spending resources hunting somebody who only killed criminals. That thread lets the show put its central question directly in front of the audience without a single character having to deliver a speech about it, and it also gives Dexter the most dangerous thing he could possibly be handed, which is approval. Rita's storyline runs parallel and pays off the groundwork laid in season 1. The drug addiction lie is exactly the kind of solution Dexter reaches for, since it explains the absences, the lying, and the odd behavior in a way that makes him pitiable rather than suspicious. It also drags her mother Gail into the house, a woman who never trusted him and now has documentation. When Rita finds out about Lila, she throws him out, and the reconciliation that follows is not built on forgiveness so much as on Rita deciding she wants the version of him she has convinced herself is real. The show is quietly brutal about that. Rita's greatest strength is her capacity to see the best in a damaged man, and it is the exact quality that will eventually kill her. Deborah spends the season repairing herself after being wrapped in plastic on a table by a man she was sleeping with, and Jennifer Carpenter plays it without any of the softness a network drama would have insisted on. She cannot sleep alone. She moves in with her brother. She overcompensates at work, and she attaches herself to Lundy, partly because he is stable, and partly because he is the closest thing to a father figure in the building. The relationship is written with real tenderness, which makes what happens 2 seasons later considerably worse. The rest of the department gets colored in around them. Angel Batista, who was stabbed by Rudy Cooper the previous year, spends this season having his life dismantled by Lila, who sleeps with him and then accuses him of rape in order to pressure Dexter into coming back to her. The charges are only dropped after Dexter kills her, which means an innocent detective nearly loses his career and his freedom as collateral damage in somebody else's affair. Masuka provides comic relief that occasionally curdles into loneliness. Captain Matthews spends most of his time protecting the department's reputation rather than the investigation. Miami Metro is not written as a competent institution, and it never becomes one, which is a running joke that eventually stops being funny once the audience counts how many officers die because nobody in the building trusts each other. The cabin sequences also gave the series its clearest thesis statement, delivered by the man in the cage. Dokes tells Dexter that he has been playing a role for so long he has forgotten there was ever anything underneath it, and that everything he believes about himself came out of somebody else's mouth. Dexter has no answer to that, and the show never gives him one. The whole run afterward is built on Dokes being correct about the two things nobody else ever said out loud, which is that the code is inherited rather than chosen, and that the disguise has replaced the person wearing it. Keith Carradine's Lundy also became the character fans wanted to see win, which is a strange thing for a show to build on purpose. He is courteous to everyone, he never grandstands, and he treats the work as a craft rather than a hunt. Every later investigator in the franchise gets measured against him. Losing Eric King cost the show something it never replaced. Dokes was the only character whose suspicion was both correct and sustained, and burning him removed the pressure that made the first two seasons feel dangerous. Later years brought in profilers, captains, and detectives with case files, and not one of them ever managed to look at Dexter the way that Sargent did across a parking lot. By the end of the 12 episodes, Dexter has reconciled with Rita, the butcher case is closed under someone else's name, and the only person who ever came close to catching him is dead and disgraced. It is the most successful stretch of his life, and it costs him nothing he was willing to keep. The season aired from September 30 to December 16, 2007, and it remains the high watermark for the show's reputation. Rotten Tomatoes logged a 96% approval rating. Metacritic settled at 85 out of 100, with every single review positive, and the consensus described a taut, suspenseful, darkly funny season that secured Dexter a place among television's great anti-heroes. The awards recognition followed. In 2008, Dexter earned an Emmy nomination for Outstanding Drama Series for its second season, which was the first time any Showtime drama had ever been nominated in that category. Michael C. Hall was nominated for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series the same year. Neither won, both losing out in a year dominated by Breaking Bad, but the nominations changed what Showtime was allowed to believe about itself. A network that had spent decades as the second name in premium cable now had a flagship drama in the biggest race on television. What the season established structurally became the template every later year tried to copy. One outside investigator closing in, one unstable person who knows too much, one personal relationship that suffers for it, and a resolution that lets Dexter survive through luck or somebody else's violence rather than through the careful competence he believes in. He does not outsmart the Bay Harbor butcher investigation. He gets rescued from it by the most reckless person in his life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next threat does not come from a task force or a stalker. It comes from an assistant district attorney with a spotless public reputation and a very specific request. Somebody in Miami is about to figure out exactly what Dexter does at night and ask if he can come along. Section 6, Season 3, 2008, and The Miguel Prado Experiment. Season 3 starts with a mistake. Dexter goes after a drug dealer named Freebo, a man who killed 2 young women and walked out of it on a technicality, and the plan falls apart the moment he enters the house. A stranger comes at him with a knife in the dark, and Dexter kills him on instinct, without preparation, without certainty, without any of the process Harry drilled into him. When the lights come up, he is standing over a man who was not a target at all. The dead man is Oscar Prado, and Oscar's older brother is Miguel Prado, an assistant district attorney with a spotless public image and a family full of political weight in Miami. Miguel starts asking questions, and the season turns into a slow negotiation between 2 men who each think they are handling the other. Dexter eventually finishes the Freebo job, and Miguel arrives while it is happening. Instead of calling it in, he covers for him. That single decision opens the door on a story the show had never attempted before. For 2 seasons, Dexter's secret had been a thing to protect. Now, a powerful, charming, articulate man knows the truth and approves of it. And what he wants is not silence. He wants to be part of it. Jimmy Smits plays Miguel as a man who fully believes he is one of the good ones, which is what makes him dangerous. He has spent a career watching guilty people walk out of courtrooms, and he has arrived at the same conclusion Harry Morgan reached decades earlier, that the system fails and somebody has to correct it. The friendship that forms between the two is the closest thing to real companionship Dexter has had since his brother, and it is written with genuine warmth. They have dinner with their wives. They talk about their fathers. Dexter, who has spent his life mimicking friendship, finds himself accidentally inside one. So he teaches him. Dexter walks Miguel through the code, explains the certainty requirement, shows him the preparation, and lets him participate in a kill. It is the single largest violation of Harry's rules in the entire series up to that point, and Dexter does it because being known feels good. For a few episodes, the arrangement even works. Two men with the same conclusion about justice, splitting the labor. Then Miguel breaks it. He murders Ellen Wolf, a defense attorney he had feuded with for years, a woman who did nothing except win cases against him. She is not a killer, and she never was. Miguel killed her because he hated her, and because Dexter had just handed him permission to think of murder as a tool. The moment Dexter works out what happened, the season's real shape becomes visible. Miguel never wanted a code. He wanted cover, and he had spent weeks studying the one man in Miami who could teach him how to get away with anything. The relationship curdles fast. Miguel begins working to frame Dexter, using his position and the enormous credibility of his office to build a trap, and he keeps smiling the whole way through it. Dexter's response strips away the last of the pretense. He kills Miguel Prado with a garrote in a kill room, and the killing is not really about the code either. Ellen Wolf gives him the justification, but the thing driving the scene is betrayal. Ellen Wolf's murder is the reason he gives out loud. The reason underneath it is that he let somebody in and it cost him. The season runs a second killer alongside all of this. A man called the Skinner is hunting Freebo through the Miami underworld, torturing people for information and flaying them, leaving the bodies displayed in trees. He turns out to be a tree trimmer named George King, a former Nicaraguan interrogator who brought his professional skills to a new country. The Skinner is functional rather than memorable, mostly serving to keep the police busy, but he does deliver one of the season's better sequences when he abducts Anton Briggs, the confidential informant Deborah has fallen for. Deborah's frantic search for Anton is her strongest material of the year, and the Skinner plot closes with him coming after Dexter directly and losing. Deborah's arc across the season sets up a great deal of what follows. She is partnered with a new detective named Joey Quinn, played by Desmond Harrington, a cop with a flexible relationship to procedure who spends the next several seasons hovering somewhere between useful and compromised. She falls for Anton, a witness she is technically supposed to be handling, and the affair puts her career at risk. Underneath all of it, she is chasing her father's approval from beyond the grave, and the more she learns about Harry over the coming seasons, the worse that gets. The other enormous development is domestic. Rita is pregnant, Dexter proposes, and the season ends with a wedding, which means the man who selected a girlfriend specifically because she would demand nothing from him is now a husband, a stepfather of two, and about to become a father. The show treats this with real intelligence. Dexter does not fall in love and change. He notices, with something close to alarm, that he keeps choosing these people over his own convenience, and he cannot explain why. The Prado family gives the season more texture than it usually gets credit for. Oscar, the brother Dexter killed by accident, turns out to have been a drug user whose public image the family had been protecting for years, which means Miguel's grief is tangled up with the work of maintaining a reputation. The third brother, Ramon, is a sheriff's deputy with a drinking problem and a temper, and he spends the season interrogating suspects off the books and coming apart in public. Miguel's wife, Sylvia, played by Valerie Cruz, becomes a friend to Rita, which drags both marriages into the same social circle and makes the eventual collapse messier. The Prados operate like a political dynasty, and the season is partly about how a family that has spent decades covering for itself produces a man who thinks the rules are for other people. Ellen Wolf matters more than her screen time suggests. A career spent getting people out of convictions makes her exactly the kind of figure the show's premise should encourage the audience to dislike, and the writing refuses to let that happen. Ellen argues, correctly, that a prosecutor who bends evidence is more dangerous to the public than any single defendant, and she is proven right in the most direct way possible when the prosecutor she is arguing with murders her. She is also a close friend of Maria LaGuerta, and her death gives LaGuerta the first of two personal losses that eventually drive her to reopen the Bay Harbor butcher file years later. Nothing in the later seasons makes sense without this one. Deborah's year runs on secrets that mirror her brother's without her knowing it. She is sleeping with a confidential informant, hiding it from the department, and lying to her partner about it, which puts her in the position of protecting her career through concealment, while her brother does the same thing on a vastly larger scale. Quinn, meanwhile, is established as a detective with a flexible attitude toward missing money and internal affairs interest, and that thread pays off across the next several seasons. Miami Metro at this point contains one serial killer, one cop under investigation, and a lieutenant playing politics, and it is still portrayed as a functioning homicide unit. The wedding at the end of the season is played almost entirely straight, and that is what makes it land. Dexter stands at the front of a church, surrounded by colleagues who have no idea what he is, marrying a woman who loves a man he invented, holding a promise he intends to keep for reasons he cannot articulate. The narration during that sequence is some of the least ironic writing in the whole series. He is not performing at that moment. He simply does not have the vocabulary for what is happening to him. Underneath everything, Season 3 is the story of the code failing for the first time in a way that cannot be walked back. Dexter kills a man in a dark house without certainty. He teaches the rules to somebody who was never going to follow them. He kills a man who does not qualify because that man betrayed him. And he learns that the framework he treats as sacred is portable enough that a district attorney could pick it up in a few weeks and use it for personal revenge. Harry's rules were supposed to be what separated Dexter from the people he hunted. Miguel Prado proves they are just a procedure, and procedures can be taught to anybody. Jimmy Smits also delivered the best guest performance the show had produced up to that point, and the industry noticed. He plays Miguel as somebody with real charisma and real grief, which means the audience spends half a season hoping the friendship works, and the turn arrives without any warning signs the writing had to plant artificially. Nothing about Miguel changes across the season. He is the same man in the first episode and the last. What changes is the amount of information Dexter has, and the show trusts the performance to make that reversal feel inevitable rather than convenient. Season 3 is also the last year the show could be described as small. Everything after it operates on a larger scale, with bigger villains, higher body counts, and stakes that reach beyond one police station. The Miguel Prado season is the final time the entire threat to Dexter Morgan is one man at a dinner table who likes him. The season also quietly set up the mechanics of the show's endgame. Every later crisis in the series traces back to somebody knowing part of the truth. Miguel Prado is the first person Dexter chooses to tell, rather than somebody who catches him, and the choice goes so badly that he spends the next several years insisting he will never do it again. He does it again, 4 separate times. The season also delivers one of the quietest and most affecting scenes in the entire run. Camilla Figg, the records clerk who has known Dexter since he was a boy and who handed him the file on his mother's murder, is dying of cancer and in constant pain. She asks him to help her die. Dexter brings her a slice of key lime pie, laced with morphine, and sits with her while it happens, and it is the only killing in the whole series performed out of kindness. He tells her she gets to see her husband again. It is also the moment the audience gets the clearest evidence that whatever Dexter claims about feeling nothing has stopped being true. Production-wise, Season 3 arrived under strain. The Writers Guild of America strike that ran through the 2007 and 2008 television season disrupted schedules across the industry, and Dexter came back into a landscape where writing rooms had lost momentum. Executive producer Daniel Cerrone had departed after Season 2, thinning out the group that built the original formula. Clyde Phillips was still running the show, and Melissa Rosenberg was still head writer, but the season is noticeably lighter on dread than the 2 before it, largely because there is no investigator closing in. Nobody is hunting Dexter. Miguel is a threat because he is a friend, which is a subtler engine and a slower one. Critics noticed. The season holds a 72% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where the consensus says the show had lost some of its dramatic edge while still delivering twisted entertainment, and a 78 out of 100 on Metacritic. Those are respectable numbers that also mark the first dip, and Season 3 tends to land in the middle of most rankings of the show. It is the season where the format shows itself. Guest antagonist arrives, bonds or clashes with Dexter, dies in the finale. Life continues. The audience did not dip at all. The Season 3 finale aired on December 14, 2008, and pulled 1.51 million viewers, which gave Showtime its highest ratings for any of its original series since 2004, when the ratings service first started counting original shows on premium channels. The show was growing while the reviews were softening, which is a combination that changes how a network behaves. Showtime now had a hit that got bigger every year, and the pressure to keep escalating the villains became the defining force behind the next season. That escalation produced the best year the show ever had. The writers went looking for an antagonist who could not be outmatched by charm or credentials, somebody who had been doing this longer than Dexter, better than Dexter, and with a family life that looked from the outside exactly like the one Dexter had just built for himself. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Somewhere in Miami, a man teaches Sunday school, hugs his wife, drives his kids to school, and has been killing on a repeating pattern of 4 for 30 years without a single police department noticing. Dexter is about to decide he can study him instead of ending him. Section 7, Season 4, 2009, and the Trinity Killer. Season 4 opens on a man who is losing. Dexter is living in the suburbs with Rita, her 2 children, and a newborn son named Harrison, and he has not slept properly in months. The premiere shows him nodding off behind the wheel and crashing his car, which is the perfect image for the whole year. His day job, his night work, and his family have finally stopped fitting into 24 hours, and every choice he makes across the next 12 episodes comes from exhaustion rather than control. Into that mess walks Frank Lundy, retired from the FBI and back in Miami on his own time, chasing a killer he has been tracking for decades. Lundy explains the pattern to a stunned Deborah. A single murderer has been moving across the country for 30 years, killing in a repeating sequence, and no police department has ever connected the cases because the killings look nothing alike and never happen in the same place twice. He calls the killer Trinity, after the 3 deaths he has managed to identify. Lundy has the number wrong, and the show reveals why, in one of its best pieces of construction. The cycle is not 3 murders, it is 4, and each one is a reenactment of a specific piece of the killer's childhood. A young woman bleeding to death in a bathtub, a mother falling from a height, a man beaten to death, and, at the start of the sequence, a 10-year-old boy drugged and buried alive in wet cement at one of the charity building sites, which is the piece Lundy never found, because missing children were never filed as homicides. 30 years of murder, performed on a loop by a man reliving the worst days of his own life over and over and calling it order. Then Lundy dies. He is shot in a parking lot early in the season, and Deborah is shot alongside him and survives. The killer is not Trinity. It is Christine Hill, played by Courtney Ford, an ambitious young reporter who has been sleeping with Joey Quinn and mining him for information. Christine is Arthur Mitchell's biological daughter from an earlier relationship, a woman raised outside his household who spent her whole life desperate for the approval of a father who barely acknowledged her. She killed Lundy to protect a man who did not want her, and when Deborah eventually confronts her with the truth, she takes her own life. Killing Lundy that early was a ruthless move by the writers. It removed the one competent investigator in the story and left Deborah grieving a man she loved while working the case that killed him. The paperwork behind Trinity is part of what makes the season land. The case files, maps, and whiteboards the show puts on screen date the first completed cycle to 1976 and stack up dozens more after it, spread across cities including Baltimore, New Orleans, Omaha, St. Paul, and Denver, always timed to fall between school breaks. Arthur Mitchell was not an unstoppable genius. He was a man with a routine and a calendar, moving often enough that no single police department ever held more than one piece of him, and the show is careful to make the point that this is how somebody actually gets away with murder for 3 decades. Not brilliance. Bookkeeping. The Quinn and Christine thread is the season's most effective piece of misdirection. Quinn talks too much to a reporter he is sleeping with, and the leaks that follow get treated as a standard police procedural subplot until the shooting reframes all of it. Christine's confession scene with Deborah is one of the show's best small moments, a woman explaining that she killed a federal agent for a father who has never once told her he was proud of her, and then removing herself from the story because there is nothing left to want. John Lithgow plays Arthur Mitchell, and the performance is the reason this season sits at the top of almost every ranking. Arthur is a deacon at his church. He builds houses for a charity called Four Walls, One Heart. He hugs his wife in front of the neighbors, drives his children where they need to go, and speaks in the warm, slightly fussy cadence of a man who has never had an unkind thought. Lithgow plays all of that completely straight, which makes the moments when it drops frightening, because the switch happens without warning and then vanishes again. Dexter's reaction to him is the heart of the season. He does not want to kill Arthur Mitchell, not right away. He wants to know how he does it. Here is a man who has been operating twice as long as Dexter has, who has a wife, 3 children, a church, a job, and a 30-year kill cycle, and who has never come close to being caught. Dexter is drowning in a life half that complicated, so he invents an identity, calls himself Kyle Butler, and inserts himself into Arthur's world as a fellow believer looking for guidance. He goes to the church. He works on the charity houses. He sits at the man's dinner table. The Kyle Butler identity produces the tensest material in the season because it puts Dexter in constant, sustained danger without a single kill room in sight. He is inside a family, using a fake name, being introduced to neighbors, standing on a construction site with a hammer in his hand, while the man beside him casually discusses scripture. Every scene carries the risk of a photograph, a stray comment, or one of Arthur's children saying his fake name in front of somebody real. The show also gets a great deal out of the fact that Arthur, for all his violence, likes him. 2 men who have spent their lives entirely alone find each other briefly, and both of them are lying about everything. What he finds destroys the entire premise. The Mitchell household is not balanced. It is a hostage situation. Arthur's wife Sally has learned to live inside a set of rules designed to keep the peace. His daughter Rebecca is planning her escape. His son Jonah is being physically brutalized and is close to breaking. Arthur beats them, humiliates them, and controls every hour of their day, and the smiling family man the neighbors see is a costume worn over a household living in constant fear. The model Dexter came to study turns out to be a warning about exactly where his own arrangement is heading. The season also gives Arthur a backstory that explains the loop without excusing a second of it. As a boy, he watched his sister Vera die in a bathtub after an accident with broken glass, an accident he was involved in. His mother jumped to her death afterward. His father died at his hands. Every 4 murders, Arthur rebuilds that sequence with strangers, casting them in the roles, and each time it fails to fix anything, he starts again. He is not killing for pleasure or hunger. He is stuck. Deborah spends the season digging into their father, and what she finds nearly ends everything. She tracks down women who worked as Harry's confidential informants, and one of them tells her the truth about the affairs he had been conducting, including the one with Laura Moser. The father Deborah built her whole identity around turns out to have been sleeping with the sources he was supposed to be protecting. Then she follows the thread further and works out who Laura Moser was, which means she discovers that Dexter and the ice truck killer were brothers. She brings it to Dexter believing he has no idea, devastated on his behalf, and tells him she loves him more than anyone. He already knew all of it, and he lets her comfort him anyway. The confrontation, when it comes, is short. Dexter finally gets him onto a table and kills him with a hammer, which is Arthur's own preferred instrument. It should be the greatest victory of his career. He took down a killer who had beaten every police force in the country for 3 decades, working alone, while holding a job and raising an infant. Then he calls Rita, hears a message, drives home, and the season ends with the single most famous scene in the series. Rita is dead in the bathtub, bled out in Trinity's signature pattern, killed while Dexter was on the table finishing him. Arthur had worked out who Kyle Butler was, and he came to the house first. On the floor beside the tub, sitting in a spreading pool of his mother's blood, is Harrison, alive and screaming. Dexter picks him up and says out loud that he is born in blood, and the shot deliberately recreates the shipping container from 1973. The man who spent his whole life running from that image has just produced it in his own bathroom, and he did it by choosing to study a monster instead of killing one when he had the chance. There is no music sting and no chase when it arrives. The horror lands as a household fact, in a room with towels still on the rail. The line Dexter says over his son on that bathroom floor has followed the franchise ever since. Every later series circles back to the image of a child sitting in blood, including a sequel built entirely around what happens to a boy raised by a man who said it out loud and then abandoned him anyway. There is one more piece of fallout the show handles well. Arthur Mitchell's family survives him, and the series does not pretend that is a happy outcome. Jonah Mitchell, the son who spent his childhood being beaten, is left with the knowledge that the polite family friend who visited their house was hunting his father, and that his own mother and sister spent years covering for a murderer. The show revisits him later, and the visit is not comforting. Trinity's cycle ended with Arthur's death. The damage he did to the people inside his own house did not. Something else about Season 4 is worth stating plainly, because it explains why nothing after it ever matched it. The season is the only one where Dexter's decision directly causes the catastrophe, and where the catastrophe cannot be undone, walked back, or absorbed by the next year's plot. He chose to study Arthur Mitchell instead of killing him in Episode 4, and the woman he married died for that choice in Episode 12. Every earlier season let him survive his mistakes. Every later season struggled to invent stakes that big again, because the show had already proven it was willing to burn down his entire life to make a point. The finale, called The Getaway, aired on December 13, 2009. It drew 2.6 million viewers, broke records for every Showtime original series, and stood as the network's highest-rated telecast in over a decade. Critics called it one of the show's most sensational years, built on the collision between suburban family life and the horror of Lithgow's performance, and it sits at 88% on Rotten Tomatoes, with a score of 8.4 out of 10. The awards followed the reviews. John Lithgow won the Emmy for Outstanding Guest Actor in a Drama Series for the role, and he also took a Golden Globe and a Screen Actors Guild Award. Michael C. Hall won a Golden Globe for the same season. Across its run, the show was nominated for Outstanding Drama Series 4 years in a row, from 2008 to 2011, and for Outstanding Lead Actor for Hall 5 years in a row from 2008 to 2012, alongside Golden Globe and Screen Actors Guild recognition, and the Peabody it had picked up years earlier. Season 4 is the peak of all of it. Two things happened around this season that reshaped everything after it. The first was that Clyde Phillips left. He stepped down as showrunner after that record-breaking finale to spend more time with his family, and Melissa Rosenberg departed as head writer at the same time. Chip Johannesson, who had come off 24, took over the top job for Season 5. The people who built the show's engine handed it to somebody else at the exact moment it became the biggest thing on the network, and every later season was made by people working inside a machine they had inherited. The second was medical. In January 2010, shortly after the season finished airing, Michael C. Hall announced that he had been diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma and was undergoing treatment. He continued working, went into remission, and appeared at the Golden Globes that same month wearing a knit cap. The lead actor of a show about mortality was fighting cancer while collecting an award for playing a man who cannot be killed. The franchise had also begun expanding around the edges by this point. An animated web series called Dexter, Early Cuts, premiered on October 25, 2009, with Hall voicing the character, covering 3 of the kills he mentions offhand in the first season, and later adding stories set immediately after Harry's death. It was small, but it was the first sign that Showtime saw Dexter as something bigger than one show. Everything after Season 4 is a series of attempts to answer a question the finale asked and never resolved. Dexter Morgan spent 30 years believing the code kept him safe and kept the people around him safe. His wife is dead on the bathroom floor because he broke it out of curiosity, and his son is now starting life exactly the way he did. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next 2 years hand Dexter something he has never had before, which is a partner who watches him kill and stays. And inside an abandoned church, a professor and his students start building tableaus out of human bodies for the end of the world. One of those stories works. The other nearly ends the show. Section 8, Seasons 5 and 6, 2010 to 2011. Lumen and the Doomsday Killers. Season 5 picks up minutes after the bathroom. Dexter is standing in a house full of police, holding a baby, and lying to everybody about how his wife died, and the early episodes are the closest the series ever came to a genuine study of grief. He cannot process it, so he does what he always does, and looks for a body to work on. He finds one in a sanitation worker named Boyd Fowler, a quiet man who collects roadkill for the county and keeps women preserved in barrels of formaldehyde out in the swamp. The kill goes to plan. What happens afterward does not. Searching Boyd's house, Dexter finds a woman still alive inside it, terrified and half destroyed, and she has watched him murder her captor through a gap in the plastic. Her name is Lumen Pierce, played by Julia Stiles, and she becomes the single most important experiment in Dexter's entire adult life. Every other person who learned his secret either died for it or tried to use it. Lumen looks at what he did to Boyd Fowler and decides she wants the same thing done to the rest of them. Because there were more. Lumen was one of a series of women abducted, raped, filmed, and murdered by a group of men who had been doing it since they were teenagers, and the survivor count is 1. The men are respectable now. At the top of the group sits Jordan Chase, played by Johnny Lee Miller, a wildly successful motivational speaker who fills arenas telling audiences to seize what they want, while running a private operation built on exactly that philosophy, taken to its worst possible conclusion. His circle includes his own security man Cole Harmon, a businessman named Alex Tilden, and a dentist named Dan Mendel. All of them wealthy, all of them functional, all of them monsters on a schedule. Boyd Fowler's barrels are worth a note as well, since they represent the show at its bleakest. He kept the women in formaldehyde, and the group he belonged to filmed what they did, which gives Lumen a set of recordings and a list of names. That detail turns the season into a revenge story, with documentation, and it removes any ambiguity about whether the targets qualify. Season 5 is the last time the code is easy to apply, and even here, Dexter breaks it twice, killing Liddy and considering others who never met the standard. Dexter and Lumen hunt them together, and the show does something with that partnership it never repeats. For the first time, Dexter is not hiding while he kills. Somebody stands beside the table, helps with the plastic, and looks him in the face afterward without flinching. He starts teaching her the way he once taught Miguel Prado, except this time, the student has an actual reason and a real wound, and the relationship becomes the only romance in the series that is honest about what he is. He falls for her precisely because there is nothing to conceal. The family unit also collapses in a way the series never reversed. Astor and Cody, who spent 4 seasons as part of his household, are sent to live with their grandparents, and Astor's confrontation with Dexter about the danger he brings to everyone near him is one of the more damning speeches any character delivers to him. Harrison is left in the care of a nanny named Sonia, and later, Batista's sister Jamie takes the role, which means the child who was born in blood spends his early years being raised almost entirely by employees, while his father works 2 jobs, one of them homicide. 2 smaller threads in Season 5 deserve mention because they show the writers taking the aftermath of Rita's death seriously. The first is that Dexter is treated as a suspect in his own wife's murder in the early episodes, which is the correct police response and something the show could easily have skipped. He has to sit through interviews, submit to scrutiny, and manage a department that has known him for years while grieving a woman he did not kill. The second is that he ends up in a grief support group, listening to ordinary people describe losses he cannot match with any feeling of his own, and the show plays those scenes for genuine discomfort rather than jokes. 2 threats close in around them. Deborah, now working the case the department calls the Barrel Girls, is closing on the same men from the legal side, and her instincts keep putting her in rooms Dexter has just left. And Joey Quinn, still suspicious after everything, hires a corrupt former narcotics officer named Stan Liddy, played by Peter Weller, to run surveillance on Dexter off the books. Liddy is dangerous because he answers to nobody and follows no procedure, and Dexter eventually kills him in the back of his own van, which is one more killing that has nothing to do with the code and everything to do with self-preservation. The season ends with the closest call of the entire series. Deborah corners the vigilante pair she has been chasing inside a building, with a plastic sheet between her and them, and she lets them go. She has worked out that the two people on the other side of that curtain are the surviving victim and someone helping her, and she decides that the men they killed deserved it. She tells them to leave, never learns her brother is standing 6 feet away, and walks out having personally granted Dexter Morgan the only official pardon he ever receives. Lumen leaves too. Once the men who hurt her are dead, the need she came in with fades, and she can go back to a normal life. Dexter cannot, and the season closes on the recognition that the only person who ever accepted him did so temporarily, because for her, the darkness was a wound, and for him, it is the whole structure. Season 5 ran from September 26 to December 12, 2010, holds an 84% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes, with a consensus praising Hall's performance across a sorrowful year, and the finale drew 2.5 million viewers. Julia Stiles was nominated for a Primetime Emmy for Outstanding Guest Actress in a Drama Series, and for a Golden Globe in the Supporting Actress category for the Lumen role, which is worth noting given how divided the fanbase is about Season 5. Whatever the season's pacing problems, the performance at the center of it was recognized as one of the strongest guest turns the show ever attracted. Season 6 is where the wheels come off. Scott Buck took over as showrunner, the second changeover in 2 years, and the new season built its story around religion. The antagonists are a pair calling themselves the Doomsday Killers, staging elaborate tableaus based on the Book of Revelation across Miami, arranging bodies into images meant to announce the end of the world. Colin Hanks plays Travis Marshall, a soft-spoken young man who restores religious art. Edward James Olmos plays Professor James Geller, his former teacher and the driving force behind the whole project. Except Geller is not there. He has been dead the entire season, killed by Travis years earlier, and every scene between the two men has been happening inside Travis Marshall's head. The reveal was intended as the season's centerpiece, and it landed badly, because a large portion of the audience had guessed it within a few episodes. The two characters never appeared in the same space as a third person. Nobody else ever addressed Geller, and the structure of the trick was visible long before the twist arrived. When the show finally revealed Geller's preserved body in a freezer, it played as confirmation rather than shock. The tableaus themselves are the most expensive-looking thing the show ever built, and the ambition is real even when the writing around it is not. Bodies arranged as the Four Horsemen, a staged scene meant to represent the whore of Babylon. Snakes, mannequins, arrangements built to announce a sequence of events out of Revelation, all of it photographed with the same bright Miami light the series always used. Visually, it works. The problem is that the whole design depends on a mystery the audience solved early, so the department spends 12 episodes decoding symbolism while viewers wait for a reveal they already have. The strongest element in the season is Brother Sam, played by Mos Def, a former convicted murderer who found religion in prison and now runs an auto body shop where he employs ex-offenders and tries to keep them straight. Sam looks at Dexter and sees the darkness immediately, and instead of fearing it, he tells him it can be set down. Their conversations are the most interesting material of the year because Sam is the first character in the series to suggest that the whole framework Harry built might simply be a choice Dexter keeps making. Sam is shot by a young man he was trying to save, and Dexter drowns the shooter afterward, which answers Sam's argument in the most direct way available. Dexter's own storyline that year is more interesting than the case. Harrison is starting school, and for the first time Dexter has to consider what he is going to teach his son about right and wrong, which pushes him into examining religion for reasons that are entirely practical. He does not want faith. He wants to know whether there is a version of morality he can hand a child without lying, and brother Sam is the only person offering one. The season also has him confront the possibility that Harrison has inherited something, watching for signs in a 5-year-old and finding enough to worry him. Deborah's season is the one fans argue about most. She is promoted to lieutenant over Quinn, a jump she has not earned and does not want, and she starts seeing a therapist to cope with the pressure. Those sessions steer her toward the conclusion that her feelings for her adoptive brother are romantic, a development the writers committed to and the audience largely rejected. It undercut the strongest relationship on the show, and it did so in a season that had very little else working to distract from it. The stray subplots are what most viewers remember as the season's low point. Lewis Green, an intern in Masuka's lab, develops an obsession with Dexter for reasons that are never satisfactorily explained, and mails him a prosthetic hand connected to the ice truck killer case. The thread runs through 2 seasons, produces one eerie moment, and then resolves without ever justifying itself. Around it, the show kept adding characters and workplace complications, which is usually a sign that the central engine has stopped generating enough story on its own. Miami Metro also gained and lost a detective named Mike Anderson, played by Billy Brown, brought in to fill Deborah's old slot. He is likable, competent, and murdered late in the season by a member of a Ukrainian criminal organization, which sets the machinery of the following year in motion. Brian Moser returned as well, not in the flesh but as a hallucination, appearing to Dexter as a guide the way Harry always had, which is a nice touch given that both of Dexter's dead father figures now argue inside his skull. The finale, called This Is the Way the World Ends, sets up everything that follows. Dexter finally corners Travis Marshall and kills him on an altar inside a church, wrapped in plastic, with candles lit around the room. He raises the blade, brings it down, and Deborah walks through the door behind him and sees the whole thing. 6 seasons of near misses, task forces, suspicious sergeants, and plastic curtains. And the person who finally catches him is his sister, standing in a doorway, watching her brother murder a man in a church. Season 6 ran from October 2 to December 18, 2011, and became the worst reviewed year the show had produced. It fell to 38% on Rotten Tomatoes, where the consensus pointed at heavy-handed symbolism, an unimpressive villain, and a repetitive arc for the lead, with Metacritic at 62 out of 100. The ratings, however, kept climbing, which meant the show that critics had started to abandon was still the most valuable thing on the network, and Showtime had every commercial reason to keep it running. Taken together, these 2 seasons are where the franchise's core problem becomes visible. Dexter Morgan is a character built for a story with an ending, and Showtime had a hit that could not be allowed to end. So the writers kept generating reasons for him to almost be caught, almost be exposed, and almost change, and then resetting him to the same position by December. Season 5 gets away with it because Lumen changes him for 11 episodes. Season 6 does not, and the closing shot of Deborah in that church doorway reads like a writing room, admitting that the resets had run out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A sister who worships her brother now knows exactly what he is, and she has a badge, a rank, and a legal obligation. What she decides to do about it takes 2 years, costs another officer her life, and ends with Deborah Morgan holding a gun on somebody she loves. Section 9, Seasons 7 and 8, 2012 to 2013, and the ending nobody forgave. Season 7 starts in the church with the knife still in the air. Deborah does not arrest her brother. She takes him home, sits him down, and decides she is going to fix him. She makes him move in with her, throws his kill tools into the ocean, and treats a lifetime of compulsive homicide as an addiction that can be managed with supervision and honesty. The show gets a great deal of mileage out of how badly that fails, because every truth Dexter hands her makes the situation worse. She learns about the Trinity killer. She learns her brother is the Bay Harbor butcher, the case her own department closed under a dead sergeant's name. She learns Rita died because Dexter chose curiosity over caution. Jennifer Carpenter's performance across this season is the best work anyone does in the back half of the series. Deborah is a police officer whose entire identity was built on the memory of a father who taught her to be honest, and she is now a lieutenant who cannot report the largest murder case in Florida history because the murderer is the only family she has. She unravels in stages, and the writing gives her real anger alongside the misery. The season's outside pressure comes from two directions. The first is a Ukrainian criminal organization called the Koshka Brotherhood, whose leader, Isak Sirko, played by Ray Stevenson, comes to Miami to find out who killed one of his men. Isak is one of the show's best late additions, an elegant and ferocious man whose motive turns out to be love. The man Dexter killed was his partner, and Isak's grief mirrors Dexter's own history so precisely that the two develop a genuine understanding while trying to kill each other. When Isak is finally shot by rivals inside his own organization, Dexter takes his body out on the boat and gives it something closer to a burial than a disposal. The second pressure is Hannah McKay, played by Yvonne Strahovski. Hannah was a teenager when she rode along with a spree killer named Wayne Randall, and she has spent the years since running a plant nursery and quietly poisoning anyone who becomes an obstacle. Dexter puts her on the table and cannot go through with it, and the relationship that follows is the most destructive romance of his life, precisely because she is not sorry about anything. Hannah poisons Deborah, Dexter turns her in, and she escapes custody. What she never does is pretend, which is the quality that keeps pulling him back. Season 7 also closes the oldest loop in the story. Hector Estrada, the man who ordered Laura Moser into a shipping container in 1973, is still alive in a Florida prison. Dexter arranges his release, meets him, and kills him, finishing something that started when he was 3 years old. It is a rare moment of the series letting him actually complete a piece of unfinished business. The individual cases across Season 7 do more work than usual, because each one is designed to test Deborah's plan. A killer named Ray Speltzer, who hunts women through a maze he builds inside his own home, walks out of custody on a technicality, and Deborah has to watch the legal system fail in front of her while standing next to the man whose entire life is built on that failure. She eventually tells Dexter to kill him, which is the moment her position collapses. 6 episodes after promising to cure her brother, she is assigning him targets, and she knows exactly what that makes her. The Koshka storyline also gives Quinn his most compromising material. He gets involved with a woman connected to the organization, takes money, and ends up covering for people he should be arresting, which leaves him corrupt in a way the department never fully addresses. By the end of the season, Miami Metro contains a serial killer, a lieutenant who committed murder, and a detective on the payroll of a criminal organization. And the survivors of that unit go on to be treated by the franchise as the people Dexter destroyed. The real antagonist of the year is Captain Maria LaGuardia, and the show earns it. She never accepted that James Dokes was the Bay Harbor butcher, and when a bloodslide turns up at the church where Travis Marshall died, she reopens a case everyone else buried. LaGuardia works it methodically, pulls Captain Tom Matthews into it, and closes on Dexter with nothing but paperwork and stubbornness. She is not a villain. She is a police officer doing the job correctly, avenging a colleague she loved, and the series puts the audience in the deeply uncomfortable position of hoping she fails. She almost does not. The finale takes place on New Year's Eve, and LaGuardia lures Dexter to a shipping container to trap him. Deborah arrives with a gun and a choice, and the show holds on her for an agonizing stretch while she decides which of the two people in front of her she is going to shoot. She kills LaGuardia. Then she sits on the floor beside the body of her friend and mentor, while fireworks go off outside, having chosen her brother over the law, over her career, and over everything her father claimed to stand for. Season 7 ran from September 30th to December 16th, 2012, and it was the show's commercial peak. It was the highest-rated season of Dexter, drawing 6.1 million total weekly viewers across all platforms, and the finale delivered the highest-rated night in the series' history. Critics came back around too, with an approval rating of 79% on Rotten Tomatoes and 81 out of 100 on Metacritic, and the consensus described it as a return to form built on real risk-taking. Season 8 had to follow that, and Showtime confirmed on April 18, 2013, that it would be the last. It premiered on June 30, 2013, a summer slot rather than the usual autumn one, and it opens with Deborah destroyed. She has quit the police, works as a private investigator for a man named Jacob Elway, and is drinking and using drugs, unable to live with what she did in that container. The season's new element is Dr. Evelyn Vogel, played by Charlotte Rampling, a neuropsychiatrist who knows exactly who Dexter is when she introduces herself. The reveal behind her is one of the strongest in the series. Vogel consulted with Harry Morgan decades earlier and helped him build the code in the first place. She is the co-author of Dexter Morgan, which means the rules he treated as his father's gospel were partly the work of a researcher who saw a fascinating subject rather than a child. She calls him her perfect creation, and she means it as a scientific claim. Vogel wants him for a job. A killer she names the brain surgeon is removing pieces of brain tissue from victims, and the trail leads to her own son. Oliver Saxon, born Daniel Vogel, was institutionalized as a boy, presumed dead in a fire, and has spent his adult life killing, while his mother built a career studying people like him. He murders a young killer named Zach Hamilton, whom Vogel had pushed Dexter to mentor, and then he cuts his mother's throat in front of Dexter, which is as brutal a beat as the show ever delivered. The Vogel reveal also quietly rewrote the entire series in a way the season never fully used. If a researcher helped design the code, then Harry Morgan was not a grieving father improvising a solution in his kitchen. He was a police officer taking professional advice on how to manage a child, from a woman who saw a subject rather than a boy. That single piece of information reframes every flashback in 8 seasons, and it arrived in a year with too many other plots running to give it the weight it deserved. The show found its best idea about Dexter's origin in its final 12 episodes, and spent most of that time on a brain surgeon instead. Charlotte Rampling was also handed the hardest job in the final season, which was making a character who calls a serial killer her creation sound like a clinician rather than a cartoon. She manages it, and her scenes with Hall have a chilly intimacy nothing else in Season 8 matches. Everything else in the season is Dexter trying to leave. Hannah returns, and the plan becomes Argentina, a new life in Buenos Aires with her and Harrison. He starts training a replacement analyst at Miami Metro. He tries to hand his life over to somebody else so he can walk out of it clean. Saxon shoots Deborah during the endgame. She is taken to hospital, and the surgery appears to succeed before a clot leaves her brain dead, with no possibility of recovery. The finale is called Remember the Monsters, and a hurricane named Laura is bearing down on Miami while it happens, carrying the name of Dexter's mother. He goes to the hospital, disconnects his sister from life support, carries her body out, and takes her out on Slice of Life to drop her into the ocean, in the same water where he dumped his victims for 15 years. Then he sends Hannah and Harrison to Argentina, turns the boat into the storm, and the wreckage is found afterward with no body. Except he is alive. The last scene of the series jumps forward, moving to a lumber camp somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, where a bearded man in a flannel shirt finishes a day of work, drives back, walks into a small room, sits down, and slowly raises his head to look directly at the camera. Dexter Morgan faked his death, abandoned his son, and exiled himself to a life of hauling timber, and the series ends on his face. The reaction was immediate, and it was brutal. The finale drew 2.8 million viewers on September 22, 2013, the largest audience in Showtime's history, and the Season 8 premiere had already become the most watched episode ever, with more than 3 million. So the numbers were enormous, and the goodwill was gone. Rotten Tomatoes settled at roughly a third of critics approving of the final season, with a consensus that accused the show of being so unwilling to punish its lead that it punished the audience instead. Metacritic logged 71 out of 100, buoyed by earlier episodes. The complaints were specific rather than vague. Deborah Morgan, the most consistently well-written character in the series, was killed by a clot after surviving the shooting, which felt arbitrary. Hannah and Harrison were shipped off to a foreign country to be raised without a father. And the ending gave Dexter neither punishment nor peace, just a beard and a job, which read as a refusal to make a decision rather than a decision. The final season also spends a striking amount of its running time on material that had nothing to do with the ending. Masuka discovers he has an adult daughter and pursues a relationship with her that occupies several episodes. Quinn chases a sergeant's exam and a romance with Jamie Batista. Deborah's private investigator boss develops his own agenda. Angel Batista is handed a promotion and a restaurant he keeps talking about opening. All of it is competent television, and none of it belongs in the last 12 hours of a series about whether a man can be redeemed or should be punished. And the imbalance is one of the loudest complaints about the season. Zach Hamilton is the season's most wasted opportunity. Vogel's proposal that Dexter train the boy the way Harry once trained him could have turned the final season into a direct examination of whether the code is a gift or a curse being handed down. Dexter agrees, takes him on, and starts teaching, and then Zach is killed off before the idea can develop. The premise of the entire franchise was sitting there, and the season traded it for another twist about Vogel's family. Hall himself has spoken about the reaction in the years since, with more patience than most of the fan base managed, acknowledging the disappointment, while defending the intention behind leaving Dexter alive and isolated. The argument in favor of the original ending is that exile without death is a genuine punishment for a man whose whole life was built on proximity to people he could pretend to love. The argument against it is that the show had already earned a harder conclusion, and the audience could tell the difference between an ambiguous ending and an unfinished one. Clyde Phillips, who had left after season 4, said in interviews afterward that his version of the ending would have been very different. He described a finale in which Dexter is strapped to a gurney awaiting execution, seeing the faces of the people he loved and the people he killed as it happens, and the show simply ending with him dead. That description circulated widely enough that a large part of the fan base adopted it as the ending they should have had, which mattered enormously later, because Phillips was eventually handed the keys back. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. 8 years later, a man calling himself Jim Lindsay works behind the counter of a fishing and hunting shop in a small town in upstate New York. He has a girlfriend who happens to be the chief of police, and he has not killed anybody in a decade. Then, a teenager knocks on his door. Section 10, New Blood, Resurrection, and the franchise that refuses to stay dead Showtime, announced the return on October 14, 2020. A 10-episode limited series, Michael C. Hall back in the lead, and Clyde Phillips returning as showrunner for the first time since season 4, which meant the man whose absence fans blamed for the original ending was coming back to write a new one. Marco Siega signed on to direct 6 episodes and executive produce. Production started in February 2021, and Dexter, New Blood premiered on November 7, 2021, closing on January 9, 2022, with an episode called Sins of the Father. The setting is the smartest choice in the whole revival. Dexter now lives in Iron Lake, a small town in upstate New York, under the name Jim Lindsay, a nod to the novelist who created him. He works behind the counter at a fishing and hunting shop. He is liked by his neighbors. He goes to the local diner, and he has not killed anyone in 10 years. He is also dating Angela Bishop, played by Julia Jones, who happens to be the chief of police, and living in a landscape of snow and pine that could not look less like Miami. Everything about the visual language is inverted. The original series was hot, bright, and saturated. New Blood is cold, gray, and quiet, and the change alone communicates how much of the character has been shut down. The voice in his head changed too. Harry Morgan is gone, replaced by Deborah, with Jennifer Carpenter returning to play her as a hostile, foul-mouthed conscience who spends the entire season attacking him. It is a much crueler device than the calm father figure, because Deb is not offering guidance. She is the guilt he has never processed, and she wants him to stop existing. The relapse arrives through a man named Matt Caldwell, a wealthy local who once caused a boat crash that killed 5 people and never faced meaningful consequences. Matt shoots a rare white deer the town treasures, and something in Dexter that has been dormant for a decade wakes up. He kills him, and then has to hide it in a town where he knows everybody and where his girlfriend runs the investigation. In the middle of that, a teenager shows up at his door. Harrison, played by Jack Alcott, has tracked down the father who abandoned him, and he arrives carrying a decade of anger and something else that Dexter recognizes immediately. The season's antagonist is Matt's father, Kurt Caldwell. played by Clancy Brown, and he is one of the strongest additions the franchise ever made. Kurt owns the local trucking business, sponsors the youth teams, buys drinks, and is the most popular man in Iron Lake. He is also a serial killer who has been abducting young women for years, and rather than disposing of the bodies, he preserves them and keeps them arranged in a hidden cabin, which is somehow more disturbing than anything Miami ever produced. Iron Lake has been losing women for decades, and nobody looked, because the man responsible is the person everyone trusts. Everything unravels in the final stretch. A true crime podcaster named Molly Park, played by Jamie Chung, comes to town chasing the missing women and is killed by Kurt. Angela, working the same case honestly, ends up at a law enforcement conference and finds the thread that leads back to the Bay Harbor butcher, and she works out exactly who is sleeping in her bed. Dexter kills Kurt with his son present, and then, cornered and needing to escape, he murders a local deputy named Logan, a decent man who never did anything to anyone, and that is the act that ends him. Harrison had been willing to see his father as a monster who killed monsters. Logan breaks the argument. Angela arrests him, Harrison comes to the cell, and Dexter finally tells his son the truth about everything, including that he should have died a long time ago. He hands him the rifle and tells him to shoot. Harrison does. Dexter Morgan dies in the snow with his son standing over him, and Clyde Phillips said afterward in plain language that Dexter was dead, that he would not cheat the audience, and that Harrison was the future of the franchise. For a lot of viewers, that was the ending the show should have had in 2013, delivered 8 years late by the person who should have written it the first time. The new blood numbers explain why none of this stayed buried. The revival brought a large audience back to a character who had been off the air for 8 years, and it did it with a finale that killed him, which left Showtime holding proof that the franchise had commercial life and a lead actor who was no longer in it. The prequel solved half of that problem by casting somebody younger. The Frame story solved the other half by deciding the bullet had not finished the job. Within 3 years of a definitive death scene, the same showrunner who called it definitive was shooting a 4th series about the man who died in the snow. It lasted less than 3 years. On July 26, 2024, at San Diego Comic-Con, during the panel for the prequel Original Sin, Showtime announced a sequel series called Dexter, Resurrection with Hall, reprising the role. Then the prequel's premiere in December 2024 quietly did the actual work of undoing the death, opening with Dexter bleeding out on a hospital gurney and being revived. Phillips explained the reasoning afterward, describing a doctor telling Dexter that a gunshot like that in summer would have killed him, but that he was shot in freezing weather, which slowed everything down enough for surgeons to reach him minutes before he was gone. The cold that defined New Blood visually became the mechanism that saved him. Dexter, Resurrection premiered on July 11, 2025 on Paramount Plus with Showtime, with a 2-episode drop, reached the cable channel on July 13th, and ran 10 episodes into September. It became Showtime's most streamed premiere, pulling 3.1 million global cross-platform viewers within 3 days, which was 44% above Original Sin and 76% above New Blood. Filming ran from January 9th to June 18th, 2025, in New York City, the first time the franchise had shot there after years in Miami, Los Angeles, Long Beach, and the fictional Iron Lake. The story picks up 10 weeks after the shooting. Dexter wakes from a coma to learn that Angela Bishop recanted her allegation about the Bay Harbor butcher, apparently as repayment for his help solving the murder of her friend Iris, and that the other deaths in Iron Lake have been explained away. Captain Angel Batista, played by David Zayas, does not accept any of it. He has him legally declared alive and starts hunting him, and Batista's pursuit is the emotional spine of the whole season, because he is not chasing a stranger. He is chasing the colleague who stood beside him for years, while Dokes and LaGuerta died. Harrison, meanwhile, is in New York, working as a bellhop at the Empire Hotel, and he has killed a man named Ryan Foster who was assaulting a drugged guest. Dexter hears the details, recognizes his son's work, discharges himself from the hospital, and goes to the city to clean up the blood evidence Harrison missed. He takes his real name back, rents an apartment, and starts driving for a rideshare app, which is where he meets Blessing Kamara, played by Entare Guma Mbaho Mwine, a driver who becomes his landlord, and the closest thing to a genuine friend he has had since Miguel Prado. The season's hunt starts with a killer targeting rideshare drivers, who has taken the name Dexter, once used for his own urge, and it produces a moment that marks how much the character has shifted. Dexter chooses to save the man's next victim, rather than secure the kill, which is not something the Miami version would have done. When he does finally kill Red Schmidt, he learns about an invitation to a private dinner for serial killers, and he decides to attend in the dead man's place. That dinner opens up the best idea Resurrection has. Leon Prater, played by Peter Dinklage, is a billionaire venture capitalist who runs a secret society of killers and keeps a vault of trophies celebrating famous murderers, including items connected to Arthur Mitchell and Brian Moser, and unknowingly to Dexter himself. Uma Thurman plays Charlie, his head of security, who is only there because the job pays for her mother's cancer treatment. The club members are a rogues gallery, played by recognizable faces. Eric Stonestreet as Al, Neil Patrick Harris as Lowell, David Dastmalchian as Gareth, and Kristen Ritter as Mia LaPierre, who becomes Dexter's closest connection in the group, until he discovers she has no code at all and will kill anyone when the urge lands. Dexter works through them one at a time while pretending to be one of them, which gives the season the tension the franchise had lost. He is inside a room of people exactly like him, performing an identity, hunting his own kind. The Gemini killer produces the best twist of the run, revealed as identical twin brothers, which lands after Dexter has already killed one and assumed the job was done. The cost arrives late. Batista, having burned his credibility with the Nipdeed by breaking laws to chase Dexter, approaches Prater without knowing who he is and reveals Dexter's true identity. Prater then offers Dexter a permanent benefactor in exchange for killing his old friend. Dexter cuts Batista loose instead. Batista attacks him in a rage, and Prater shoots him. Dying, Batista hears Dexter confess to being the Bay Harbor butcher while insisting he did not kill Dokes or LaGuardia, and he dies cursing Dexter's name, which is the most honest ending any of the Miami Metro characters received. The finale gets Dexter out of Prater's vault with Harrison's help, ends with Prater dead and dumped into New York Harbor, and leaves Dexter with the billionaire's files, his yacht, and a fresh list of targets. The season also stuffed in returns from across the franchise, with John Lithgow appearing again as Trinity, Eric King as Dokes, Jimmy Smits as Miguel Prado, Christian Camargo as Brian Moser, C.S. Lee as Masuka, and Desmond Harrington as Quinn. Harrison's arc across the season is the most substantial thing the franchise has done with the character. He is a 19-year-old who killed a rapist, got away with it, and cannot live with it, and the show gives him the guilt his father never had. He nearly confesses to police twice. He considers college, sits in on a criminology lecture, and starts talking about a career in law enforcement, which is a bleakly funny outcome for a Morgan. When Dexter finally reaches him, the promise he makes is the one thing the character has never offered anybody, which is that he will stop trying to shape somebody in his own image. That lecture also planted the next season. Detective Claudette Wallace speaks publicly about the New York Ripper, an unidentified killer she failed to catch, and Dexter recognizes the murder weapon from Prater's trophy collection. The finale confirms the Ripper's name as Don Framp through the files recovered at the crime scene, and Brian Cox was cast in the role for the second season, which means an antagonist was seeded, named, and cast before most viewers realized the season was building toward anything beyond Prater. Critics were kinder than expected. Rotten Tomatoes logged a 95% approval rating from 62 reviews, with a consensus joking that Dexter had brushed off a minor case of death to rediscover the thrill of the hunt, while Metacritic came in at 65 out of 100. The dissent was consistent, with reviewers at Variety and Entertainment Weekly arguing the show was creatively unnecessary and leaning on nostalgia after New Blood had given the character a definitive ending. The business around it kept moving. Original Sin was canceled on August 22, 2025, despite the earlier renewal, and by September 2025, Phillips indicated that a planned prequel about the Trinity Killer was unlikely to happen. Resurrection was renewed on October 8, 2025, with production moving to Paramount Television Studios after Showtime's parent company merged with Skydance. Season 2 began filming on April 13, 2026 at Sunset Pier 94 Studios in Manhattan, with the series staying in New York partly because remaining there added another 10% tax credit on top of the 30% it received the first year. Joining Cox for that season are Dan Stevens as Owen Stark, the Five-Borough Killer, Bokeem Woodbine as Captain Mixon, and Nona Parker-Johnson as Fiona Mixon, with Desmond Harrington promoted to series regular as Quinn. Laid end-to-end, the timeline runs from a shipping container in 1973 to a soundstage on the Manhattan waterfront more than 50 years later, covering a novel, 8 seasons, a prequel, 2 sequels, an animated web series, a comic run, and 1 death that everybody involved insisted was permanent. The through line is a man who was handed a set of rules by a guilty police officer and spent 5 decades finding out that the rules were never the thing keeping him alive. Every person who ever tried to fix him, catch him, join him, or love him ended up dead or damaged, and he is still out there on somebody else's yacht with somebody else's list. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.